We often speak of intelligence as a gift, as a tool to succeed, to rise, to solve, to create. And yes, it is those things. But we rarely speak of the cost that comes with it, because what most people don't understand is that real intelligence is not just a matter of knowing more, it's a way of seeing more, feeling more, perceiving reality with a depth and clarity that most are never forced to confront. And there is a quiet burden in that, one that sits beneath the surface of brilliance, a weight that doesn't always announce itself, but is always there. The intelligent person sees through things, not just through data or ideas, but through people, through motives, through masks. They hear what isn't being said. They notice the contradictions others ignore. They sense the undercurrents of emotion in a room, the tension in a conversation that never rises to the surface. They watch the patterns repeat, individually, culturally, historically, and they recognize the inevitability of it all. This kind of vision is not always empowering. It can be exhausting, because when you see the deeper layers of life, you can't unsee them. And when everyone else is comfortable at the surface, you begin to feel like a stranger in your own world. This perception isolates. It sets you apart, not because you want to be superior, but because you can no longer pretend. You can't laugh at what's not funny. You can't believe in what's hollow. You can't accept the simple answers that comfort others because your mind has already dissected them and found them lacking. And so you remain quiet in rooms where others speak freely. You carry a knowing that can't always be shared, not because it's too complex, but because most are not ready to receive it. And this creates a paradox. You understand so much, and yet you feel so misunderstood. People think intelligence brings control, power, certainty. But often it brings the opposite. The more you understand the human psyche, the more you realize how fragile it is. The more you grasp the nature of reality, the more you encounter its ambiguity. The more you analyze life, the more you see its chaos, its contradictions, its mysteries. Intelligence doesn't always simplify, it complicates. It doesn't always soothe, it exposes. And that exposure, when constant, can feel like carrying too much light in a world that prefers the dark. There's a certain grief that comes with knowing too much. You grieve not just for your own innocence, but for others' blindness. You see how people cling to illusions to survive, how they lie to themselves, to each other, to preserve comfort. And you can't blame them. But you also can't join them, because once the veil has been lifted, once your eyes have adjusted to the full light of truth, going back is no longer an option. And so you carry it, quietly, the weight of knowing, the burden of clarity. You carry it in conversations, where your silence is not ignorance but mercy. You carry it in relationships, where you sense the deeper wounds people haven't named. You carry it in solitude, where your mind won't stop turning over truths no one asked you to hold. And perhaps the hardest part is not the knowing itself, but the loneliness it creates, the ache of being surrounded and unseen, of walking through a world that values simplicity while your mind swims in complexity. Yet in that burden there is also something sacred, because to see deeply is also to care deeply. To understand is to feel responsible, not in a burdensome way, but in a human one. You begin to understand suffering not just intellectually, but intimately. You see the roots of fear, the echoes of trauma, the silent cries beneath anger and apathy. And in that, your intelligence becomes something more than analysis. It becomes empathy, insight that doesn't just observe but seeks to heal. That is the quiet redemption of this burden. While others may dismiss your depth or misunderstand your silence, you know that your mind is not your enemy, it is your gift. Not because it makes you better, but because it allows you to serve, not from above, but from beside. You begin to use your vision not to judge, but to guide, not to escape, but to connect. Because in the end, intelligence is not meant to isolate, it is meant to illuminate. The more you see, the more you're called to become a light for those still learning how to see. When you begin to perceive life with uncommon clarity, something unexpected happens. You start to feel a quiet distance from the world around you. It isn't arrogance, it isn't superiority. It's simply the natural result of seeing what most people don't, or perhaps can't, see. You begin to notice the subtleties others overlook, the contradictions they ignore, the lies they've grown comfortable believing, and with each layer of awareness, a small wedge forms between you and the familiar world. Over time, it grows into a vast space where few seem to walk beside you. The deeper your understanding, the more difficult it becomes to stay connected to what once felt normal. Conversations that once held excitement now feel shallow. Small talk feels painfully empty. Laughter around trivial things no longer stirs anything in you, because your mind is elsewhere, buried in thought, reflection, complexity. You don't fit into the noise, the distraction, the busyness. You don't participate in it, not because you think you're above it, but because it simply doesn't hold meaning for you anymore. And so the intelligent person, particularly the deeply reflective one, often finds themselves surrounded yet deeply alone. You may be in a room full of people, nodding, smiling, even speaking, but inside you are somewhere else entirely. You see what others don't, and the gap between perception and presence becomes isolating. It's like trying to speak a different language in a place where no one wants to learn yours. You long for depth, for sincerity, for silence, but the world, in its surface-level comfort, rarely offers these things. This is the pain of seeing too much. The moment your vision pierces the illusion, you lose the ability to pretend. You can no longer feign interest in what doesn't matter. You can't participate in the comfortable denial that shields others from their deeper truths. You've tasted something real, and now everything that isn't real feels hollow. You begin to realize that truth has a price, and that price is often your sense of belonging. And this is where many begin to turn inward. The desire to connect remains, but the capacity to do so in the same old ways disappears. You crave others who see as you do, not for validation, but for communion, not for agreement, but for resonance. Yet those individuals are rare and often hidden. So you retreat, not because you want solitude, but because you cannot bear the weight of constant misalignment. You're not avoiding people, you're avoiding the pain of feeling alone, even while surrounded by them. This isolation doesn't come from superiority, it comes from sensitivity. The more you understand people, the harder it becomes to judge them. And yet, the harder it also becomes to relate. You see the trauma behind the cruelty, the fear beneath the anger, the conditioning behind the complacency. You see that most people are not awake. They are sleepwalking through life, repeating patterns inherited from generations before them. And once you've seen that, how do you go back to pretending everything is fine? But there is a strange beauty in this isolation too, because it is not empty. It is filled with insight, with awareness, with a deepening connection to your own inner world. In stepping away from the noise, you begin to hear yourself more clearly. You begin to understand not only others, but yourself, your wounds, your longings, your truths. You become more honest, more discerning, more rooted in your essence. You stop needing to be understood and start focusing on understanding. And perhaps the most profound realization is this: you are not truly alone. Others exist who feel as you do. They may be quiet, they may be few, but they are out there, walking their own silent paths, seeking something real in a world of imitation. And when you find even one of them, the connection is unlike anything else, not built on convenience, but on shared vision, on the unspoken understanding that comes from carrying the same invisible weight. So yes, the pain of seeing too much is real, and yes, it often isolates. But that isolation can become sacred space, a space where you are refined, where you shed what no longer fits, where you learn the art of living honestly, even in a world that prefers illusions. And eventually, in that space, you begin to realize your loneliness is not a curse. It is the path to depth, to clarity, to a different kind of belonging, one that begins not with others, but with yourself. The truth is, clarity doesn't just illuminate, it burns. When you begin to see things as they are, not as you wish them to be, a different kind of pain emerges. It's not the pain of failure or rejection, not the sting of disappointment or loss. It is quieter, deeper. It's the ache that comes from understanding too much, from carrying the weight of truths most people never stop to consider. And this pain, more than anything, is what makes the intelligent heart feel both burdened and aware. To see clearly is not to feel superior, it is to feel deeply. The more you see, the more you feel. The more you notice, the more it touches you. The more aware you become of human nature, the more you are exposed to the suffering woven into it. You see how people live behind masks, how they betray themselves just to fit into roles they were never meant to play. You watch as they deny their dreams, suppress their emotions, bury their authenticity beneath layers of fear, obligation, and conditioning. And you don't just witness it, you feel it. As if their pain, their disconnection, their quiet desperation echoes inside your own chest. It is this emotional depth that makes intelligence such a double-edged sword. Because it's not only your life you see with clarity, it's everyone else's too. You see the parent trying to love their child but failing because they never learned how to love themselves. You see the partner who craves connection but keeps pushing love away out of fear. You see the friend who pretends to be strong but is quietly falling apart. You see the pain beneath the performance, and even when you say nothing, it moves you, because knowing changes everything. This kind of emotional burden doesn't show up in dramatic ways. It often arrives in silence, in the sleepless nights, the heavy thoughts, the moments where your heart suddenly feels full for no clear reason. You carry stories that aren't yours. You grieve for people who don't even know they're lost. And you begin to understand that knowledge is not power, it's responsibility. The responsibility to care, even when it hurts. The responsibility to feel, even when no one sees or thanks you for it. The responsibility to keep your heart open in a world that constantly tempts you to shut it down. People often assume that intelligence makes life easier, but the truth is, it makes life heavier. You no longer live on the surface, and therefore you no longer feel surface-level things. Joy is deeper, yes, but so is sorrow. And it's this sorrow, this intimate relationship with the world's unspoken suffering, that often shapes the inner life of a deeply perceptive soul. You begin to sense that your emotions are not just personal, they are collective. You're tapped into something bigger, something that stretches far beyond your own story. This sensitivity is often misunderstood. The world praises productivity, stoicism, and the ability to push through. But those who feel deeply often move more slowly, speak more carefully, and carry more than they reveal. They are dismissed as fragile or overly emotional, when in truth, they are holding more than most people will ever realize. And they are doing it silently, gracefully, sometimes painfully. But even in this pain, there is a strange form of meaning. Because it connects you, it reminds you that you are alive, not in a mechanical, functioning sense, but in a visceral, spiritual one. You are awake to the texture of life. You are not numb. And that alone is something sacred. The ability to feel fully, even when it hurts, is not a weakness. It is a sign of presence, of humanity, of depth. The goal, then, is not to escape this emotional toll. It is to learn how to hold it without being crushed by it, to feel the weight without letting it close your heart, to let it deepen your compassion rather than drown your spirit. Because once you accept that this is part of the path, part of the price of clarity, you stop resisting it. And in that surrender, you find a kind of peace. Not the peace of ignorance, but the peace of understanding. It is not easy to live this way, but it is real. And in the end, real is all that matters. There is a quiet conflict that exists inside the intelligent and self-aware mind, a kind of tug-of-war between two opposing forces. On one side, there is the intellect, sharp, curious, always analyzing, always seeking to explain, define, and categorize. It wants to understand, to break things down into pieces, to map the architecture of life so it can feel some sense of control. And on the other side, there is the soul, mysterious, intuitive, not interested in certainty but in connection, not in facts but in meaning. It doesn't need to know why, it simply knows. And this inner dialogue between the mind and the soul can become a source of great tension, especially for those who feel both deeply and think deeply. The mind is like a constant architect. It builds frameworks, develops patterns, draws conclusions, and builds logic. It gives structure to our experiences. It helps us survive, predict, organize. It asks the questions, how does this work? What does this mean? What should I do next? But the soul, if we can call it that, is more like a musician or a poet. It doesn't care about structure. It lives in the feeling of things, the texture, the nuance. It wants to sit with the mystery, not solve it. It says, just be, just feel, just listen. For a highly intelligent person, this creates an almost unbearable contradiction. You can think your way through any problem, and yet you still feel empty. You can explain your trauma, your behaviors, your fears, but you still feel them. You can make sense of the world and still not feel at peace in it. Because the soul does not live in logic, it lives in presence, and the mind, brilliant as it may be, often tries to drown that presence with its endless stream of thought. This conflict becomes especially painful when you try to grow. The mind wants goals, blueprints, strategies. It wants to know where you're going and why. But real transformation is rarely linear. It's chaotic. It's emotional. It doesn't follow a formula. You may find yourself pulled towards something with no logical reason why, or find peace in something that defies every rational argument. And in those moments, you feel the mind revolt. It resists what it cannot grasp. It distrusts the unknown. And yet the soul keeps whispering, urging you toward that unknown because it knows something the mind does not. The difficulty is learning how to honor both. To let the mind do its job without letting it take over. To listen to the soul without becoming lost in the fog of feeling. Most people fall into the trap of choosing one side. Some become so ruled by thought that they disconnect entirely from feeling. They become hyper-rational, over-analytical, constantly seeking control through knowledge. Others lean only into intuition and abandon structure altogether, drifting without grounding. But the real task, the hard, quiet work, is to bring the two together, to let your thoughts be guided by feeling, to let your intuition be supported by understanding. This balance does not come easily. It takes courage to trust what you can't explain. It takes humility to admit that not everything can be solved with thought, and it takes strength to feel deeply without drowning in it. But when you begin to hold both, the clarity of mind and the wisdom of soul, something begins to change. You become less reactive and more reflective, less desperate to find answers, and more open to discovering meaning. You stop fighting the tension and begin listening to what it's trying to teach you. And in that stillness, you realize something else. The mind and the soul were never enemies. They were just speaking different languages. The mind says, prove it. The soul says, feel it. The mind says, what's the point? The soul says, this is the point. The mind wants to climb the mountain, the soul wants to sit and watch the sunrise, but both want to experience life. They just approach it differently, and when they finally begin to work together, you no longer feel like you're being torn in two, you begin to feel whole. This is the integration that many spend their whole lives resisting, because it's not easy and it's not quick, but it is worth everything. Because when your thoughts and your feelings, your analysis and your intuition, your mind and your soul all begin to move in the same direction, you stop living in pieces, and you begin, perhaps for the first time, to live in harmony. There comes a point in your journey when you realize that understanding others, truly seeing them, recognizing their motivations, their wounds, their contradictions, does not necessarily make life easier. In fact, it often makes it harder. Because once you begin to understand people truly and deeply, you can no longer judge them the way you used to. You begin to see that behind every harmful action, every irrational decision, every moment of cruelty or distance, there is almost always a wound, a story, a fear, a part of that person that was never given the care it needed. And when you see that, you stop reacting with anger and start responding with sorrow. But sorrow, even when it's compassionate, still hurts. When you understand someone's pain, you carry a piece of it. Not because you want to, but because you can't help it. You become like a mirror, reflecting their truths back to them, even when they refuse to look. And sometimes they resent you for that. Sometimes they pull away, reject your insight, deny what you've seen. Because not everyone wants to be understood. Some people fear it. To be truly seen is to be exposed. And exposure feels dangerous when your entire life has been about building walls. And so, understanding becomes its own kind of burden. You sit across from someone who hurts you, and you understand why they do it. And somehow that makes it harder to walk away. You see the child inside the adult, the confusion behind the mask of confidence, the fear behind the anger, and it tugs at your empathy. Even when boundaries are needed, even when self-respect demands space, there is a part of you that mourns for the one behind the behavior. And this is one of the great paradoxes of insight. It softens your judgment, but deepens your pain. This emotional intelligence, this ability to see behind the curtain, it doesn't give you peace right away. It gives you complexity. You stop labeling people as good or bad, and you start seeing them as layers, wounds wrapped in coping mechanisms, survival strategies masquerading as personalities. And when you live like this, navigating relationships is no longer simple. You can't just hate someone who hurt you. You can't just walk away without feeling the sting of what could have been. You feel everything. And because of that, you carry more than most. People might call you wise or intuitive or mature, but what they don't always see is that with that wisdom comes weight. You don't just understand others, you absorb them. You internalize what they don't say, what they're afraid to feel. You hear the silence between their words. And it's exhausting at times, because you're not just dealing with your own emotions, you're feeling echoes of others as well. And it's not something you can turn off. Once you see, you cannot unsee. But even in this heaviness, there is meaning. Because understanding is the beginning of compassion, and compassion is the bridge that connects us, not through words but through presence. When someone feels truly understood, even if just for a moment, something shifts in them, a part of their armor softens, a small crack forms in their wall, and in that moment healing becomes possible, not through advice or solutions, but through being witnessed, through feeling, perhaps for the first time, that they don't have to defend who they are. This is the quiet gift you give when you see deeply. You become a place of refuge for others, a space where masks can fall. And yes, it's draining at times, but it's also beautiful, because in offering that space you remind others and yourself that we are not alone, that someone can understand us even when we cannot fully explain ourselves. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. Still, it is essential to remember that understanding others does not mean sacrificing yourself. Compassion is not submission. Seeing someone's pain does not mean you have to carry it for them. There is a balance to be found between empathy and boundaries, between love and self-protection, and that balance is not easy, but it is necessary. Because the truth is, you cannot pour endlessly from an empty cup, and no matter how much you see in others, you must also see yourself. So, if you feel the burden of understanding, if your heart aches not just for your own wounds, but for the quiet suffering of those around you, know this: it is not weakness. It is not too much. It is the cost of seeing with an open heart. And though it may weigh heavily at times, it is through this burden that your humanity shines. There's a certain loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being different, from seeing too much, feeling too deeply, thinking in ways others don't. It's the kind of loneliness that lingers even in a crowded room, not because there's no one around you, but because very few truly understand what lives within you. And when your mind is filled with layers, with patterns, with questions that seem invisible to others, you can begin to feel like an outsider in your own world. This kind of isolation isn't loud, it's subtle. It doesn't announce itself with despair. It moves in quietly, over time. You try to connect, to share your thoughts, your insights, your emotional experiences, but they often fall flat. Not because others don't care, but because they don't see what you see. And so you learn to keep most things inside. You nod along, you play the part. But inside, there's always a distance, a space, between what you feel and what you can express. Between who you are and who the world expects you to be. The more aware you become, the more alone you can feel. Because awareness separates. It's not that you think you're better than others, far from it. It's just that you see too much to stay comfortable in the usual conversations, the surface-level interactions, the mindless routines. You crave depth. You long for meaning. You want to talk about what matters. But so often, what matters to you is what others avoid: pain, death, identity, consciousness, truth. And so, you carry these thoughts with you, quietly, like secrets no one asked for. And yet, despite this loneliness, despite this deep inner life that seems to go unshared, there is something profoundly necessary about it, because in that quiet space of solitude, you begin to hear yourself more clearly, without the noise of distraction, without the performance of fitting in. You start to feel the raw texture of your own being. And though it hurts at times, it also heals. Because what you find there, beneath the silence, beneath the ache of isolation, is your truth. Not the one the world gave you, but the one that was always yours. This kind of solitude becomes sacred, not because it's easy, but because it's honest. In the absence of constant validation, you begin to know yourself without mirrors. You no longer measure your worth by how much others understand you. You begin to hold your value in your own hands. And that is where real strength is born. Not in applause, not in popularity, but in presence. In sitting with yourself, in all your complexity, and not turning away. Of course, there are days when this depth feels like a curse, when you wish you could just turn it off, just be simpler, lighter, more like everyone else. But that is not your path. Your path is to see. Your path is to feel. Your path is to stay awake in a world that numbs. And yes, it's lonely at times, but it's also real. And in that reality, you find others, quietly, slowly, who also see, who have walked that same path of isolation and found meaning in it. And when you meet them, there's no need to explain. There's just recognition. a shared silence that says, I know. This kind of connection is rare, but it is enough. It reminds you that your loneliness was never a punishment, it was a preparation. A sacred space being carved out inside you so that when the right souls came along, you would have the depth to hold them. And until then, the solitude teaches you how to hold yourself. So if you find yourself feeling separate, if you feel like no one quite understands the way you think or the way you feel, don't rush to escape it. Sit with it. Learn from it. Let it shape you. Because this loneliness is not empty. It is full of life waiting to be discovered, full of wisdom that only silence can reveal. And maybe, just maybe, this very loneliness you've carried is what will lead you back to yourself. If this message resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of deep thoughts, the ache of unseen truths, or the quiet pain of being misunderstood, don't carry it alone. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more powerful insights to help you feel seen, grounded, and connected on your inner journey. And if you found even a moment of clarity here, leave a comment. Your voice may be the light someone else is looking for. Thank you.